guess the big issue is, to what extent will President Trump achieve his objectives? He is treating Russia as a spent force, has suffered something like 1 million casualties in Ukraine. The economy is tanking. It's only going to require a few more sanctions, and Russia will come running to the negotiating table. And he has a slightly different view of China, but comes to the same conclusion that China's economy is suffering. And again, a little bit of a tightening of the screw, and they'll come to the table. And Iran is in such a pickle economically and militarily that it's only going to take a little bit of a tightening of the sanctions screw, and we will have a regime change in Iran. And then hip, hip, hooray, I've negotiated peace and all is going to be well and I will achieve my objectives. Reality is going to be somewhat different. Russia's combat deaths are somewhere between 89,000 and 100,000. And that actually comes from an organization that is anti-Putin. Ukraine's casualties are in the million mark. And in fact, if you compare the deaths of soldiers exchanged between the two countries, it's a 15-to-1 ratio, which actually would give you combat deaths in Ukraine of over 1.3 million. And there's no question that Russia is gaining ground and has basically won the war in Ukraine. Its economy is not tanking. Yes, it was weaker last year and continues to weaken simply because the economy was running too hot. Inflation is running at 10%. So the central bank has raised interest rates to 21%. But growth, according to the IMF, should be 1.3% this year compared to 3.8% last year. And that's despite all the sanctions. And Russia's military preparedness, probably second to none in the world. The sense that I'm getting is that Putin is proverbially pissed off by Trump's remarks about him and about Russia. So is he going to come to the negotiating table? Friends in Moscow say that's doubtful. And if they do, it'll be on Russian terms. The Russian terms, we know, will not be acceptable to Trump. So I suspect that Putin will never accept a ceasefire. The war will go on in Ukraine until Ukraine is totally exhausted, out of men, out of equipment, and out of money. Then negotiations will take place. But it's interesting that Trump does not want the negotiations to be about Ukraine per se. It's about restructuring of Euro-Asia. But again, that's not Trump's attitude. He wants a deal, period, not resolving the issues. The real issue confronting Trump's advisors is less resolving the wars between NATO and Russia and the conflicts in the Middle East, but more between disassembling BRICS, group of nations. You do that, and then automatically the wars/conflicts fall into place. If we allow BRICS to mature into an operating entity, then our hegemony will be broken, and so will the dominant use of the dollar in trade and investment. So whether President Trump has accepted that view or not is still unclear, but I suspect he will come round to it. Primary objective will be to try to break up the alliance between China and Russia and between Iran, Russia, and China. I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. Both Xi and Putin and their advisors basically saying that's never going to happen. It may happen in 20, 30 years, but certainly not in the foreseeable future. So what does that mean? I think it means that playbook will be to increase sanctions severely against Russia, to try to cut off their energy revenue, play nicely to Xi in Beijing. Don't forget that Musk has his gigafactory in Shanghai and is very close to Premier Li. So will he be the intermediary between the two presidents? What might be part of being nice to China in return for China loosening their ties with Russia is to do a deal over Taiwan, such as that if you do blockade or invade Taiwan, we won't go to support the island. But that said, or what you are seeing happening in Taiwan is that the KMT majority in the legislature have just severely cut the DPP's budget, so hindering the government from making their defenses against the mainland. And just recently, China has announced group travel for residents of Shanghai and Fujian provinces into Taiwan. So there is a natural movement going on to bringing the island slowly into the mainland without going to have military conflict. I think this is a slow but steady process. Is he going to be able to achieve the objective of getting Greenland over Denmark's dead body? What is the reaction to the rest of the EU? What would the Greenlanders think? Yeah, sure, we know why he'd like Greenland. Greenland's got critical mineral resources, and it's a pivotal country in the growing Arctic region's pivotal position in the world. I mean, if he physically takes it over or bribes Denmark, how is the rest of the world going to view that? Threatening Panama, I think, is more pivoting to China because the ports are run by a Chinese company at both ends. And perhaps he's looking at Panama. I take over Panama, I'm going to reopen the copper mine. We are a big importer of copper. We've been saying for some time that over the first 6 to 9 months of this year that we will see a large correction in global equity markets led by America, with the S&P down by about 20% and the FANGs down by about 40%. And this will be predicated on the US economy once all the revisions to the BLS GDP data's come out, that the economy is not nearly as strong as it's being made out to be, and that we will continue to see tensions in Europe and in the Middle East. But following that correction, when Trump brings in gets his tax cuts, etc., and deregulations through the system, and central banks across the world stimulate their economies, and China will actually have a very good growth this year. So we will see a very sharp recovery in global equity markets and commodity markets, base metal markets, from around the third quarter of this year until into 2028. And it's around that time that a lot of the big cycles, war cycles, debt cycles, demographic cycles, weather cycles, very important, start to turn positivity into negativity. Time frame, 3 years. I think people should realize that the weather cycles are going to be a very dominant factor in this. The first one is the Beaufort-Gaia cycle, which is when fresh water that is kept around Greenland comes into the Atlantic, and it's cold water. So immediately your temperatures start falling. And according to some experts, that will probably start happening by the end of this year. That will cause a problem in food production in some parts of the world. The other big weather change is the 89-year Gleisberg cycle, which actually should start appearing either late this year or early next year. And the Gleisberg cycle is what caused the US Midwest Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when you had a collapse in cereal production. So forget all this, what I consider to be political nonsense about climate change. It's part of the Davos crowd's way of trying to control people. But the real changes in weather are nothing to do with that. It's to do with sunspot activity and temperatures of the oceans. The big point about talking about these weather cycles is that food prices are going to soar, not just 10 or 20%. So my advice to people is make sure that your deep freezers are kept full of the foods that you need or whatever. There will be an increase in money supply because the economy is going to slow down very significantly in the first 9 months of this year. So yeah, the Fed will play the game, and I'm sure he'll be encouraged by the president. We are seeing the bottoming of inflation, as inflation has been tracking so closely to what we experienced in the 1970s and early 1980s. We're at that trough now. Everything that I piece together tells me by the end of this year, inflation is going back up. So if we follow that syndrome as well as we have recently, then CPI is going to peak at around 13%. What does that do to long bond yields? 13% plus. Well, I think the market is going to do it for him. We've got, following the 10-year yield, we've got it going to 5%. And then by the end of this year, down to about 3.5%. So the market is going to do it for him. And I think the new Treasury Secretary will want to see lower long-term rates. He's got a lot of refinancing to do. The difference between 3 and 5 is huge, but it's what happens after that